Understanding and improving our power, negotiation, and relationship skills are crucial to business success. But how do we better grasp master's level concepts and apply them to ourselves and to others? Marketing and sales are full of myths, misconceptions, and sometimes flat out lies. Join us as we leave the echo chamber and learn from one of the most lauded professors at the Kelley School of Business. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Rethink Marketing Podcast. Unfortunately, Paul is unable to join me today, but we have an incredible guest expert to expand our minds and hone our business skills, so it should still be a fun conversation. And if Paul were here, I'd welcome him as the predominant player of professional power. But since he's not, let's go ahead and bring in today's guest. We are joined today by Dr. Carolyn Goerner, a clinical professor of management at Indiana University Kelley School of Business, MBTI master practitioner, SHRM certified professional, sought-after executive educator, author of The Confident Millennial, LinkedIn learning instructor, and renowned expert on power, negotiation, imposter syndrome, generational management, and beyond. In fact, she once auditioned for a Broadway show just to keep herself humble. She believes that to be successful, you should strive to be a person that other people want to help succeed. We're in for a real treat today, folks. Welcome to the Rethink Marketing Podcast, Dr. Carolyn Goerner.
Oh, Colin, thanks for that great intro. It is fun to be here.
Well, I'm really excited to dive into today's conversation. I'd like to start just understanding your background a little bit. So you had if my research is all correct, you had a debate scholarship for your undergrad studies. You worked for Arthur Andersen. You got your master's in communication from IU, great school.
Oh, yeah.
You had a decade-long career in human resources, went on to earn your PhD, and now you have an impressive career as a clinical professor and executive educator. That's a lot of career pivots. That's a lot of going back to school. I mean, just walk us through some of the mentality of this amazing series of careers, because I don't think we can even call that one career.
No, and what's funny about it is every time someone asks that question, I go back to John Lennon. Life is what happens when you're making other plans. And so it kind of seems like, on the one hand, it kind of seems like it's been, okay, let's say arbitrary. But on the other, there's a weird kind of logic to it that's brought me to where I am. I did the debate scholarship at the University of Southern California. And at the time, the courses that kind of were interesting and also fit my schedule were all in philosophy and religion. And so I just kind of went with the critical thinking route. And I happened to stumble into the 1 year that Arthur Andersen in California decided that they were going to look at hiring liberal arts graduates instead of accounting graduates because they were worried about the critical thinking skills of accounting graduates. Now, I'm old, so this was back in the 80s, and obviously business schools have come a long way since then. So we're not seeing public accounting firms do that. But as I was walking through the interview process, the partner in charge of human resources kind of grabbed me off to the side and said, "Carolyn, I realize you're in this audit potential program, but I'm starting to do some work in human capital consulting. And so I wondered if you might want to join me in HR." And my actual response was, "That sounds great. What's HR?" And so went into that conversation with him, and he is actually the person who coined the phrase that you mentioned earlier in the introduction: conduct yourself so the people around you will want you to succeed. And so that came from a guy named Bob Henry, who was a partner at Andersen. And I found myself always sort of being on this learning curve. It seemed like every time I turned around, there was something interesting to do that required me to go read a lot and talk to a lot of people and sit in on some classes and kind of figure that out. So I did the human capital consulting piece for about 10 years. And to be perfectly candid, burned into a crispy critter. 10 years of consulting is a lot, particularly in the 80s when we did not talk about work-life balance very well. So called my father and said, "I can't do this anymore." And his explanation was, "You're right. You've 80-hour weeks for this long wasn't meant to be done. Go to grad school." I thought that sounded pretty good. So my dad and my stepmom both got their PhDs in Indiana, and I had been here when I was a very little kid and thought, why not? So left California, came here and did my master's in rhetoric, realized that the level of communication and the critical thinking was important, but that I really missed the business stuff. And so went ahead and did the PhD at Ohio State. And I've had one job since then. And so I've been on the faculty at Kelley for 24 years. And it really is. And so I think the logic to it is now what I primarily teach is influence and negotiation. And that takes rhetoric, and that takes constant learning, and that takes reading a room and asking questions. And I feel like in this oddly magical way, all of those random things have really prepared me to be where I am now. And so it's funny how you look back in hindsight and say there was a theme to that, because I have to tell you, boy, as it was going on, I couldn't find a theme to save my life.
But it seems like you've had a really enjoyable career. You've gotten to do a lot of different things. And I would imagine having the understanding of people with the HR consulting and having the understanding of rhetoric and logic and influence, those probably come together very well for the understanding of power and obviously negotiation. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Well, frankly, the one thing that puts them together is empathy and the ability to read the room and really figure out what's going on with the other people. So anything that gives you the capacity to see what's happening in a room through other people's perspectives is really a strength when it comes to influence and negotiation. The moment in my class that I think the students hate the most is when I say to them, I don't care if you're right. I care if you can convince other people to do what is right.
Interesting.
And of course, my engineers shudder.
I'm sure.
But that's really what it boils down to. And so I see so many people just use all of these facts to convince themselves that what they want to do is absolutely the right thing. And they lose complete sight of the fact that they have to convince somebody else.
So how are some good ways that we as professionals can train empathy? I think about little kids, and it's easy to see a 3-year-old who has empathy and then a 3-year-old who's very selfish and just doesn't have that empathy. Some people I feel like are more naturally empathetic or compassionate than other people. How do we take people that maybe skew a little bit lower on the empathy scale and train them into being more empathetic?
I'm glad that you brought up the fact that it does come more naturally for some than others. And that's absolutely true. But the big thing that we can do to train empathy is to get people to see things from different perspectives. So quick exercise, right? Super Bowl is coming up. And if I ask you, first of all, what is that?
Sure. I would say it's the most watched sporting event of the year where the average 30-second spot is $6 million. And it's where advertisers and agencies get to showcase their big splashes for the year. But I'm coming at it from a marketing perspective and an advertising perspective, not from a professional athlete's perspective.
Bingo. And I could not have paid you enough for that response, because that's exactly what the story is. For me, it's something in which my beloved Packers are not playing.
Nor are the Bengals, unfortunately.
Thank you. For others, it's a Taylor Swift potential sighting. But if I'm going to throw a party, I am going to say that it's an opportunity for dip. It's when I make my wings. It's obviously don't talk during the commercials. It can be don't talk during the games if you're a particular team fan. It can be don't talk during the halftime show if you're really going to watch that concert. I still remember Lady Gaga lowering herself in for the halftime show.
Yes.
It can be just an opportunity to get together and see friends. And so when I start to think about throwing a Super Bowl party, empathy is being able to see it through all of those eyes and basically realizing that there's no safe time to talk. But it's also making sure that I think about how everyone in the room is going to see that party. And so that's what we're talking about in terms of exercises to develop empathy. And people can just be reminded to do that. So you're in a meeting, you know what it is to you. What is it to the other person?
That's great. I love this idea of different perspectives, because I feel like a lot of perspectives, this is my own experience, so correct me if this is not backed up by research or anything of that nature, but it seems like being able to wear other people's shoes, so to speak, comes from having a variety of experiences and just being bad at different things. Because it's so easy for us to step in and say, I've been doing marketing for almost a decade and a half now, and I'm really good at marketing. But you know what I'm not really good at? Accounting or something of that nature. And so to try to learn things about accounting or learn things about operational efficiencies or what have you, stretch me and put me in new places. And that's just within the realm of business. That's not to mention, painting or playing a new instrument or something of that nature. And so the ability to step back and go, yes, I have the curse of knowledge and I know a lot about this, but I don't know something about that. Let me learn from someone else who has the curse of knowledge, something new, and then they can be frustrated that I'm not picking it up. So I feel like that really helps develop empathy as well, is just the variety of learning new skills and just being bad at things. And I know you have some stories about intentionally putting yourself out there and intentionally putting yourself into situations where you know that you're not going to be the best. Do you care to share any of those and how that's helped you develop your empathy?
I'll be glad to. But first and foremost, let me just say thank you, because that was said better than I could have said it. It's
I disagree
certainly
with
the
that.
case. Oh, well, no, it is certainly the case that the more that I recognize that there are other perspectives and other experts, and I stay, I hate the phrase stay in your lane, but I also recognize that it's not my job to be an expert on everything. And
Right.
so the beauty of it all, the beauty of diversity and business and different things in the world is that there are other people who do that and you can just appreciate it. And I think the first thing is to kind of get over this idea that because there's something out there, I have to know what it is and be good at it. I mean, that's just not true. So I'm a huge theater junkie. If there is a live performance of almost anything, including kindergarten kids singing a song, I'll probably show up, right? And that isn't because I'm very talented as an actor or a singer. And in fact, the story you referenced in the intro is absolutely right on. I was spending some time working in New Jersey, and I thought, you know what? I want to know what a Broadway audition looks like. And so I found an open call and got myself on the train and the subway and got myself to the theater and got my little card and was, to be in a room with people who do this for a living and to see the talent and the intensity was humbling. But you know what? I got my 10 minutes to do my monologue and sing my song. And no, I did not get a call back. But what that gave me in terms of empathy for performers is something that I will never give up. And to this day, every time I look at people on stage, my heart just is happier because I know what they went through to get to where they are. And so it's a really interesting phenomenon. There's something psychologists call the spotlight effect, right? And it says that whenever we're feeling really self-conscious, we see ourselves as if we're in a spotlight. So it's like, everybody's going to notice that I have hair out of place. Everybody's going to notice that I'm tripping over my feet, right? And the reality is that we all, if everybody is feeling insecure, all we do is worry about ourselves. We don't see each other at all. That's the irony. But if we can get into an empathy place, if we can start worrying about other people, we get out of that paralyzing spotlight thing and we start to just relax. And so, I always tell folks, if you're at a networking event, go find someone who feels more uncomfortable than you do and go help them, because that'll get you out of your own way. And so it's that freedom to just say, you know what? I'm not going to be very good at this. You know what? This is not going to be my future. But if I'm willing to relax and let down my guard and be vulnerable and try it, I have opened myself up to empathy in a way that no other experience can.
No, I think that's really, really good. And if memory serves, you recited Shakespeare. Is that right?
I did the Viola's 12th Night. I left no ring with him. What means this? Yeah, that's about as far as I remember it. And sang a song called They Go Wild, Simply Wild Over Me.
Fantastic. It seems like you said, a very maybe humbling, but very vulnerable experience. And then it gives you that additional appreciation and just relatability to folks that are performing in live theater. So very, very cool. Now, we've talked a little bit about empathy and vulnerability And I think the challenge is it's easy to develop influence and to establish a place of power when people see you as being vulnerable and empathetic. It can be very difficult to do that when people see you as, like, the robot with low EQ or something of that nature. But it feels very counterproductive to be vulnerable and to be empathetic when you are trying to establish yourself into a position of power, particularly in a corporate work environment. So help us understand, what is power, what is influence, and how do vulnerability and empathy get us there?
Power is really interesting. And think about it as the reason that people do what you ask.
Interesting.
And so why would somebody do a favor for you? And if you think about it, chances are really good that the last 2 or 3 favors you did because you liked the person. Now, there can be because somebody's an expert. I do what my doctor tells me because I don't care to diagnose myself on WebMD, and I will, go ahead and take her as an expert and do what she says. So we rely on people for expert power. We can sometimes rely on people for their experience. If somebody's done something and I haven't, I'll learn from them, and so that could be a source of power. I may rely on somebody who has, worked really hard or put in a lot of time. I may also, just because someone's in a position where because I said so can be all they have to say, I may do what they say as well. But the times when I really step up and do more than the minimum are when I'm helping somebody or I feel like I'm giving back to somebody. And so that likability as a source of power is absolutely the most pervasive in terms of why we do things. It lasts the longest and it can be the strongest. And my mom, sorry, random story, but my
I love
mom
those.
was a minister's kid. And as a preacher's kid, she and her brothers and sisters were not allowed to say, "I hate you." Right. So what they used to say to each other, even into adulthood, was, "I love you just enough to get to heaven, but no more."
Oh, that's too funny.
Is that good?
That is.
But I use that analogy because if I coerce someone into doing something, or if I use my position to get somebody to do something, they are going to do just enough to get to heaven, right? They're going to do just enough to get me to go away and no more. Whereas if I come in and we have a relationship and I make the person feel really good about being a part of this request, and I and at that point it becomes personal, and now I get more, right? Now I get commitment instead of compliance. And so it's a really interesting phenomenon that, yes, we think we should be going in and saying, "I am the authority, I am in charge, listen to me and follow my lead," when the reality is that people are going to do more for us more willingly if it's done from a place where they believe they've made the choice.
That makes so much sense. I think about the sort of higher up the food chain you get, the more you need commitment, not just compliance. I think about, the McDonald's model or the Chick-fil-A model or even the Subway model, Chipotle, you name it, right? Where, I mean, literally the model is so simple. We just have to get high schoolers to come in and be compliant. The higher you go up the food chain, when you're delivering tough conversations to employees about bonuses, or you're having a difficult conversation about somebody who's maybe underperforming, or you're having a good conversation with somebody who's outperforming and you're looking for the next step, having that person be committed is way more important than having them be compliant. And I can definitely see how switching from do this because that's the standard operating procedure will fail us, and doing this because it's the right thing to do and doing it because it's, at some level beneficial for the greater good. It just seems so much more motivational, and that allows people and empowers them to do the right thing when someone's not looking over their shoulder and micromanaging them too.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. And yet, it's also scary as heck, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
because I have to step back and trust that other people are going to do what they say they're going to do. And that can be terrifying for a lot of folks. I mean, when we define trust as a willingness to be vulnerable, then if I'm going to trust somebody to carry out an assignment or, give the right food to somebody in the drive-through, I have to be willing to step back and be vulnerable, give up control. And that's scary.
Well, and the irony with trust is that when someone's in power, we expect them to be trustworthy.
Yes.
But the opposite of that is definitely true, because
Yes.
when someone's in power, if they're not micromanaging everything and demanding compliance on everything within particular rubrics, if they're actually delegating some authority, and that's when we think about managers and supervisors that we enjoy working for, most of the time it's those people who, yes, they're in power over us, but they're delegating that authority and giving us some autonomy and mastery and all the other things. But it comes from this ability to trust. So I love that you brought trust up, because I think it seems crucial.
Oh, it's absolutely central. And what's interesting, just to kind of tie all of this together, there's some research that indicates that as people rise through levels in the organization, they actually have less empathy.
Interesting. Is that because of age?
Part of it is that there's, but part of it may be that there's also just this sense of I'm not receiving as much empathy. I mean, let's face it, leadership can be lonely. And the higher we go, the fewer peers we have. And so one of the things about empathy is that it really does kind of build on itself. The more someone's working on it with me, the more I'm going to work on it with them. And so if I don't have anyone who truly understands what I'm going through that I can talk with and be vulnerable with, then I'm not necessarily going to have practiced my empathy as well. And then there's another, this is the counterintuitive piece that always blows my mind. It turns out that we are actually less empathetic to people who have gone through something we've gone through. So you may think that the best person to call if a kid is being bullied is someone who was bullied as a kid, right? That would be the connection. But there's something weird that happens in hindsight where people say, you know what? I got through that. And so we minimize how hard things that we've gone through are. And it also makes it then hard if someone's worked their way up through the organization. And if someone comes to me and says, Carolyn, I worked a 60-hour week, my response could be, yeah, well, come talk to me when you hit 90 and let's see how you feel.
And then do that for 10 years.
Bingo.
Right.
And so that's something that we all kind of have to watch, is seeing the what other people are going through our own lens. And so having empathy, if we just keep comparing it to our own experience, actually makes it harder.
That's really fascinating, because you would think, again, not having read the research, you would think the opposite would be true. Somebody who was bullied, somebody who was laid off, somebody who was, fill in the blank, they would be more empathetic. But I'm trying to think about my own experience, and I would say that's definitely true, where if somebody goes through some adversity that, I have experience with, I almost flip to my, Mr. Fix-It hat, where I'm like, oh, well, what I did that worked for me was, steps 1 through 5, versus just sitting in it with them and going, wow, that really sucks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating.
So to me, that always kind of comes back to the whole influence thing, because we feel we are most influenced when we are presented with something that allows us to make a choice that feels right for us. And that requires a message that it contains some empathy, shows that the other person understands us, and that it's genuine. And so, I'm going to be a lot more persuaded. If you were just to tell me, hey, this is a really good restaurant, I'm going to go, okay, great. But if you tell me that 60-year-old professors from Indiana really want this, then I'm going to pay more attention, because it feels more relevant to me.
And that comes back to, I'm a big Seth Godin fan. I read a lot of his work. Yeah. But he talks about, I think it's in Tribes maybe, but he talks about people like us do things like this.
Yes.
And that's so relatable, because when you think about, a lot of people in this demographic with this income, with this job title, do this thing, then all of a sudden we feel like, to your point, we're making the right choice for us. And it seems like as marketers, we can do a really good job of framing that, so people are doing the easiest, best selection, which is hopefully our product and service.
Right. Right. And the key to that is making sure that it almost feels like it's safe if somebody else like me has done it. And so there's almost less vulnerability in my going to that restaurant because I know that it's okay. And I put this in air quotes because it makes me crazy for people like me.
Certainly. But ultimately, that's what we want. We want to be known. We want to be appreciated. We want to be valued for feeling like we're part of a crowd. So that makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So all of that gets interesting. And then you bring negotiation into the mix.
Yes, exactly. Because if we didn't like being vulnerable and empathetic during the power conversation, we're going to love it during negotiation, right?
Oh, indeed. Yeah. Let's just turn everybody's competitive fire on and then see how they feel. Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. It's interesting. There really are two types of negotiation, right? There's the I'm going to go in and haggle, the stereotypic, I'll give you $10. No, I want 20. No, we know we're going to do 15, but we have to walk through the game anyway. And then there's, and those are the things that often are the parts of negotiation that make people nervous because it feels confrontational. And I mean, let's be real. Negotiation is an inherently aggressive act, right? Somebody says, here you go, I'll offer you this. And you say, no, I want something different. And it's aggressive.
And it can feel deeply personal because sometimes I think about, going to Haiti and negotiating with some of the art vendors there. But mostly, I'm happy to pay $15 for something versus $12. It's sort of like, it's just a fun exercise, if you will, right? But I could see how if you are making something and you're investing in it and you're collecting the resources and you're putting the time into it and you're making the artwork, it's not just this contract isn't good enough for our legal team. It's this piece of artwork that you slaved over is not good enough for me. And I could see the personalized or the level of personal sort of psychology that goes into that versus, hey, my legal team said we need different terms on this contract.
And that's why salary negotiation is so hard because it feels
well, then you work with your boss for the next 5 years too, right? Remember that awkward confrontation we had when you were trying to hire me?
Exactly. So not only does it mess with the relationship, but even though we can step back and logically say, all right, I've seen the salary surveys and my position should be worth, 110,000. Okay. And we can look at that. But if somebody says, no, I'm only going to offer you 108, we feel like they think we're $2,000 less worthy.
Yes.
And even though we can talk about our budgets and our salary equity internally and all of those things, and all of that's true and important, boy, when we start to talk about compensation, it feels like you are putting a worth on me. And if you turn down what I think I'm worth, right, that feels personal. And then there's well, I can't believe I'm going to ask for this much. I can't believe. And then the imposter syndrome piece can kick in because then I ask, am I worth that much? And so the whole nuance of job and salary negotiation just brings all of that to a bubbling boil.
Well, and I think too about the perception following that negotiation where I got what I wanted. Did I ask for enough? Should I have asked for more? And then there's this Monday morning quarterbacking that goes on where you go, oh man, they met the salary, they met the vacation, they met the whatever that request is. And I do a decent amount of contract negotiating for my role when we're buying a new piece of technology for marketing or something of that nature. And there's always something where I'm like, oh, they easily agreed to 30-day terms. Should I have asked for 45-day terms? Those sorts of things where there are certain things that are non-negotiable. Like we have to be at this price per user seat. I cannot go above that because that's what's budgeted. And then there are other things like payment terms and, the ongoing maintenance fees and those sorts of things, the cost per new user seat or what have you. If I add somebody that I go, oh, this is something that in the future will be really beneficial. So if I can negotiate that, great, but it's not the end all be all. And understanding from their perspective what's non-negotiable and what is negotiable is huge. But I don't think, Dr. Goerner, I've ever gone into a conversation and I've said, hey, my non-negotiables are these. Mm-hmm. And what I'm happy to flex on are these things. Because we're coming at it, again, kind of adversarial where they're trying to get their best margin and their best profit and paid as soon as possible and all of the wins that they want to chalk up. And I'm trying to delay payment and lower, user seat cost and all sorts of other things. So, but at the end of the day, I want them to be a really good partner vendor that I'm going to interact with for a long period of time. And they want me to be a customer that is happy to use their product, that drives word of mouth to them, et cetera. So really, we're coming at this from different perspectives, but we kind of want the same thing in the end. It's just the details can flex. So help us unpack that for folks who do a lot of professional negotiation, please.
Well, first and foremost, what's interesting is that there is often buyer's or seller's remorse if people don't feel like they had to work to get the deal. And so if I walk in and say, I want this, and you say, okay, then I immediately am going to do exactly what you just described. Oh my goodness. Well, I must be undervaluing this. I must be not have thought about, right? And so there's research indicating that people are more satisfied with a deal when they have the opportunity to work for it.
Interesting.
And so there's some of that, for lack of a better way to put it, expectation that we're going to play the game, and that we kind of walk away from this and say, hey, look what we made. We made this great deal. And now we can go forward and do good things together. And so there's for lack of a better word, almost a symbolic quality to the whole conversation, because we worked hard to make this deal and we came together and we beat the odds. And so now when we do word of mouth and when we do give you a discount on a new user, we're in a place where we can do that and say it's because our relationship is so good or whatever it might be, and kind of work through that. So I find that again a little ironic, but absolutely true, that people often say, I feel like my best relationships with suppliers or with customers are the ones where we really had to work hard to get a deal because we got through it together.
It almost sounds like, I think about people who go through difficult things when they're dating and they have stronger marriages, right? Like the loss of a parent or something of that nature. It almost reminds me of that a little bit, where, hey, we suffered through the crucible together and now we're stronger on the other side, versus, well, you were generally pretty happy and I was generally pretty happy and we arrived at generally agreeable terms and now we're just going to go about our ways. And I could see that too, where when I'm talking about word of mouth, hey, we couldn't negotiate user seat costs, but we negotiated the heck out of implementation timeline or ongoing support or payment terms or what have you. And then I'm giving word of mouth to somebody else where, if I didn't know what mattered to that vendor, when I was going and singing their praises, I might go sing their praises to somebody else. And they thought, oh, well, you're probably overpaying per user seat and I can go in and negotiate that. Well, maybe now they look at it and they realize that can't be negotiated, but I can negotiate these other things. And if the vendor has those items that are truly flexible, then my word of mouth referral is even more valuable to them. So there's so much subtlety and nuance to that. It's a very interesting topic to unpack. You could probably teach an entire course on that, right?
Why? Yes, I can. And enjoy it very much. In fact, part of the reason that I love teaching negotiation is because no two are ever the same. And it brings out so many different things. People have differences in how risk averse they are. They have differences in how confident they feel. They have differences in how comfortable with conflict they are. And based on all of those things, they will approach negotiation in very different ways. So I always tell people, my job is not to make you a cookie cutter negotiator. My job is instead to help you figure out a style that works for you. And so a lot of becoming a negotiator is frankly some of the things that you've already expressed. It's understanding what I find important. And it's knowing that I can ask a bunch of questions, that hearing no is not going to be the end of the world for me. And that I have this notion of, okay, well, if that didn't work, let's try something else, as opposed to the minute somebody says no, I shut down.
You talk a little bit in, there was a keynote or something of yours that I watched about finding the why behind the what in your negotiation. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? Because I think you kind of touched on it, but I'd love to hear you just give us a little, sermonette on why why understanding your why matters so much in negotiation.
Okay, careful first of all on asking a preacher's grandkid for a sermonette.
Fair enough.
But fundamentally, the why is the underlying, what problem am I trying to solve? And what am I trying to get out of this negotiation? So, for example, it may seem really straightforward. If I go in to buy a car, I want a vehicle that I can drive from A to B. But there's really more why to that. I want a car that makes me feel, at least for me, I want something safe. I want something practical. I commute almost an hour every day. I want something that's going to be really comfortable. I want something that's going to make my commute feel pleasant. And so the why for me isn't just, get from A to B. The why for me is I need something that I'm going to get in and sit down and feel good. On the other hand, the why for somebody else may be it has to be electric, or it has to have this gas mileage, or it has to make economic sense. And the why for somebody else might be because I look really good in a red car. And so it's understanding your why and what it is that you're trying to get out of this whole negotiation. And we don't always go in and say, I want a red car, right? I mean, that's not, or even if we do, we don't say it's because that's my color. But if we understand enough about our own needs and enough about kind of the underlying interests that we're trying to fill, then we have a much better job of being flexible. So if I go in and say, I want something that I am going to be comfortable in, that's going to have a real safe feel to it, suddenly that opens up lots of options. If I go in and say, I want something red that I look good in, that opens up different options.
It's interesting. So obviously the marketing and sales podcast here, but so much of that resonates with sales because, we'll talk to junior sales reps, and sometimes the problem that we think we're trying to solve is not the actual underlying problem.
Exactly.
And the same thing's true for marketing, right? We go in and we think the problem is X, we're going to sell against X. And yes, that's a problem, or it's an inconvenience, or maybe it's an aspiration, but the underlying problem or the underlying aspiration is actually totally different. And if we can understand that, and not in a subversive, manipulative way, but in a very genuinely helpful way, if we can get down a couple of layers and really address the root, that seems like it's way more potent and way more powerful versus, the surface level, here's what we think the problem is. And I'll say too, Dr. Goerner, and feel free to disagree, but most people don't know if they don't take a beat to reflect and try to self-understand and be self-aware about, hey, I'm not a people person. Why am I not a people person? If they don't take a minute and figure out, I want a red car. Why do I want a red car? Or I want this salary. Why do I want that salary number? Why is that so important to me? It can be really difficult for us to know if we're actually achieving that, or if we think we want a particular salary, or we want a particular car, or we want a particular XYZ. And then we get in and we go, that didn't really fulfill me. Now the goalpost has moved.
Right. And it becomes a sense of, I didn't know what those underlying needs were. And so I didn't come to a deal that met them. And you're 100% correct. If I don't know what it is that my interests are, there's no way that I can walk away from a deal happy unless I get extraordinarily lucky, which rarely happens. So
right. If there's a formula to get extraordinarily lucky, please tell me what that is.
Exactly. I would bottle that and sell it. No question. I think the other piece there is, we look at something like value-based selling and we say, totally important. I need to know not just the features of the product, but what the features of the product mean and how I get the value. But so often people don't, as a buyer, I haven't really thought about that value proposition to the level that I need to. And so when I talk to folks in sales who are committed to value-based selling, which by the way, I love, it still becomes part of their job is to educate the person and to ask the kinds of questions that lead people down the path to say, what really is the value to me here? And of course, then we're back to the dilemma, which says, gosh, Colin, this is the first time we've met. I don't know if I know you. Can I tell you that I just look good in red? I mean, I don't. And so as we try to get them to those answers and should think about those things, we then run into this issue of, well, we've got to develop some trust first. And that takes time. And so the whole thing gets even more complex.
Yes, absolutely. And I think about all the ways that we can lose trust too in a negotiation. And if we're spending the time building a good foundation, there are so many variables that can go wrong along the way that undermine that foundation too. So I can definitely see how there's no one size fits all. And I have to say, I appreciate the fact that we're not talking about tactics. We're talking about sort of underlying fundamentals, again, self awareness, empathy, those types of things that make a huge difference. But it's not, well, hit them with the assumptive close and the negotiation will be finished, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's two reasons that I teach the tactics, but I don't focus on them. And the first is that if all somebody does is use those, they come across as very disingenuous. And they come across as, it's almost that trust violation. If someone is too gamey, for lack of a better word to put it, then I am going to look at them and say, oh, they don't care about me. They're just here to play the game. And that's going to make me more defensive. It's going to make me cling to my side a little harder. All of that is true. And then second, the reality is that some of those work and sometimes they don't. So we could talk about anchoring. And for sometimes giving a high opening offer, if my partner is not an experienced negotiator, yeah, anchoring is going to work all the time. If my partner is you who negotiates regularly, you're going to look at my anchor and go, well, that was cute. Don't do that again.
I think it's really cool too that you refer to the counterparty as your partner. That's really interesting.
Yeah, always. And this is your partner in the negotiation. It's a subtle shift, but it goes along too with some of the research that says if I put two people across the table from each other and ask them to negotiate, it's more adversarial. If I put them side by side and tell them they're working on a problem together, they are much more likely to reach a solution that has more collaborative win-win pieces to it. And if I really want to make it good, I'll put them together side by side in front of like a whiteboard where they each have a pen and tell them to co-create a deal. And that shift then gets them really thinking about, well, how do we make this work and get the most value out of this on all of these pieces? And so the more that we can get that, hey, this is you against me. This is you and me against the problem.
Right.
And so I use that terminology on purpose.
That's fantastic. I love this idea too of just like shared blank space where you can kind of start together versus somebody coming in and saying, here's what I need, and somebody else saying, here's what we need. How do we get to the middle? Well, if we're starting from something blank, we both get to co-create what we both need. And then there's less, framing bias or anchoring bias, whatever you want to call it.
Amen.
Well,
Amen. And so you walk in, you list everything that you've got to talk about on the whiteboard and then get started.
Fantastic. I love that. Next time I have a tough negotiation, I'm going to re-listen to this episode and I've got a lot of really, really good ideas.
As long as you tell me how it goes.
Yes. This has been a great conversation talking about empathy and vulnerability, looking at different perspectives, the spotlight effect, doing things because you like somebody, power, looking at the expert, the experience, hierarchical power, but ultimately how you help a likable person, getting commitment, not just compliance, redefining trust as willingness to be vulnerable. Obviously, we've talked about empathy from above and empathy from below, the two types of negotiation, making people work for it a little bit so they have that level of satisfaction, and then changing our mentality to partner versus adversary when we're going through negotiation. We are the Rethink Marketing Podcast. We like to ask each guest, and you are no exception, what is one thing that you are rethinking? It can be personal, it can be professional, it can be academic.
I love that question. I am really rethinking the stereotypes around gender and negotiation. For a long time, in fact, there's a book out there called Women Don't Ask that gets cited a lot. And it turns out that that's not exactly true. And
I've been married long enough, I can tell you women do ask.
Yeah.
Sometimes they expect you to know without asking, but.
And it's also the case that it's not necessarily about gender as much as it is around training and negotiation and being confident in initiating it. And so which I love the fact that I am having to step back and say, gender isn't playing the role that I thought it was. There are other things going on in terms of people understanding their interests and people being comfortable and confident in the process that really make a bigger difference. And so for me, that's the big thing that I think about at 3 a.m. when I'm awake.
So I'm very curious now. This will be another 45-minute conversation, I think. But is that more of a personality type versus a gender?
It is. There's definitely a personality component. There's also, though, the idea that we've got to manage the potential for violating stereotypes. And so the way that I can potentially do that is if I allow you to keep your stereotypes under the radar and you're not kind of thinking about them, they're unconscious, then if I initiate a negotiation, you may be affected by but wait a minute, women don't negotiate stereotype, and it can color what you're thinking without you even knowing it or being aware of it. But
is there any benefit to me calling out? So I think about, okay, I'm a white male. I work in a marketing role, and I think people like me negotiate, or they ask for, or they say these things. Is there an element of me speaking to that busts my own bias that's actually very beneficial to me personally versus the counterparty or the partner in the negotiation?
Yes, absolutely.
Fascinating.
Basically, if I can make that bias explicit, if I can bring it to the front of your mind and make you think about it, you're less likely to act on it.
Interesting. That makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Once we call it out and we name it, and I think that's very true too with, I think of imposter syndrome, and if I call it out and go, hey, I'm having a bad case of imposter syndrome right now, that deflates it and can minimize the effect that it has. So that makes sense too if we think, oh, I think that people like me do this thing, and then I'm going to call it out and say, I know that most people think that people like me do this, but actually we're going to go the opposite direction. That's really interesting.
Yep. It's fun.
Well, this has been such a fun conversation. Thank you so much for making time for it. Is there anything that we didn't get to that you wanted to cover? I feel like this was a very wide-ranging conversation.
I cannot tell you. I don't remember the last time I enjoyed a conversation this much. So thank you.
I'm flattered. Thank you so much. Well, Dr. Goerner, if people want to follow up with you, you have LinkedIn learning courses, you have a book like we mentioned earlier. How can they do that?
LinkedIn is the easiest way. So if you if you go to Carolyn Goerner, you can not only connect with me there, and please tell me that you found me on the podcast, but also the LinkedIn learning courses are available. If your company does not have a subscription and you send me a note, I can actually send you a link to get to one of my courses for free for a while. So please do that.
That is an incredible offer. I mean, the material is fantastic. So that I hope people will take you up on that, because that is very, very generous of you.
Well, they do some amazing work. I feel lucky to play in their sandbox. It's cool.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Goerner, thank you so much. We'll look forward to our next conversation, because I think there's a lot of rocks that we did not get to turn over today.
I would love that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If people want to connect with us, where should they go, Paul?
RethinkMarketingPodcast.com, Colin. What can listeners do to help us in return for this sage marketing wisdom and our pithy humor?
They can help us by leaving a review on their favorite platform or sharing this episode with a fellow marketer to help them cut through the clutter.
Well, until next time, keep rethinking those common assumptions.